Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Youthman. Over the next week, I will be doing my final review on the Monolith HTP1 processor, and then I'll be uninstalling that and putting in its place the brand new Marantz SR8015 2020 flagship receiver. Now, at some point in your home theater journey, you're likely going to at least consider moving from an AVR to what we call separates. And if you're not familiar with that term, don't worry. By the end of this video, you'll understand what is separates, what does that entail, how does a processor differ from an AVR, and then I'll share with you some pros and cons of both. More people are beginning to get into home theater now than ever before, and so I realize that a lot of my subscribers are guys that are brand new to this. They're just getting into home theater, and so if you're new to the channel, thanks so much for stopping by. I'd encourage you to subscribe to the channel because I produce 2 to 3 videos every single week that I'm sure you'll enjoy. So enough talking, let's dive right in. All right, so here we have 2 units from Marantz. Down here we have the SR8015, and up here we have my AV7705. And at first glance, they look almost identical. We've got the same front layout. If I open up this little panel here, you can see we've got all the same inputs, all the same buttons. So what is the difference? So the SR8015 is what we call an AVR, which stands for Audio Video Receiver. This is pretty much an all-in-one unit. So we've got everything that includes audio and video processing. So for things like Dolby Atmos, DTS:X, Oro 3D, it handles all of that audio processing. We've also got video switching. So if you take all of your sources, let's say you've got a 4K player, you've got a Roku, you've got an Apple TV, you've got a PlayStation or an Xbox, you can plug all of those directly in here. And then as you change the input, it will adjust all of the settings for you. Your video will display, your audio will be processed. And so it does all of that for you. Now, an AVR has one other feature, which is built-in amplification. Now, this particular unit, the SR8015, has 11 channels of internal amplification. And in the future, when DTS:X Pro is released with a firmware, it will actually expand that to 13.2 channels of processing. Now, in comparison to the SR8015, up top we have the AV7705. Now, this is not an AVR. This is what we call a pre-pro. Some people call it a pre-pro because it's a preamp and a processor, or some people just refer to it as a processor. Either way is pretty much meaning the same exact thing. Now, with a processor like the AV7705, it does not have internal amplification. So that means you're going to need to pair it with either a single, maybe 11 channel or a 9 channel or a 7 channel amplifier, depending on how many speakers you have in your setup, or you're going to need to pair it with multiple amplifiers. So there is no internal amplification built in to a processor. So now let's go ahead and turn it around. We're going to look at the back side of it because there's some differences there as well. Actually, before I do that, you can see there's a little bit of size difference. One thing with an AVR is you have to kind of cram a lot of stuff in there. We've got to have an additional area for a massive toroidal transformer that's inside this unit. And so you can see there's some added depth there. The other thing is this one definitely weighs a lot more because of that amplification as well. So looking at the back of these 2 units, you can see there's a lot of differences in this AVR and this processor. The first thing we notice is down here we have all of our speaker outputs. Now, this is for the 11 channels of amplification that it provides. So you've got like your front, left and right, your center, surrounds, your Dolby Atmos, and so forth. So you would basically come out of this AVR, say for instance from your front right, and we would connect. I'm using banana plugs. I absolutely love banana plugs. They just make it super easy and convenient. So now my speaker wires are connected, and then the other end of your speaker wire would connect to your individual speakers. And you would do that for all 11 channels or 7 channels or 5 channels or 13 channels, whatever you have connected. Now with a processor, you see we do not have any connections for speakers. That's because this processor does not have internal amplification. And you can see down here we have a little bit different type of connection, which is called an XLR. So you can see there's 3 pins there, and on an XLR cable on the inside here we've got 3 holes. So what we would have to do is take the output of this, let's say our front right channel, plug in an XLR cable, and instead of going to a speaker, this other end would need to connect to a separate amplifier. So in my case, I have the Monolith 11X amplifier. So I'm coming out of this into the back of my amplifier, and then you would come out of that amplifier with your speaker wire and then go to each individual speaker. Now, if your amplifier does not have balanced XLR inputs, you can see right over here, we also have unbalanced pre-outs that you would take using just a regular RCA cable and going from this unit into your amplifier, and then of course out of your amplifier with your speaker wire to each individual speaker. So now that we've looked at some physical external differences between an AVR and a pre-pro or a processor, now let's talk about some pros and cons of each. So let's start off with the AVR pros. Number one, they're less expensive. Typically, when you buy an all-in-one AVR, you're going to spend less than you would if you were to buy a processor and a separate amplifier or multiple amplifiers. Compared to using separates, an AVR also takes up less space. Because everything's housed in one chassis, you only have the one unit as opposed to having a processor and another amplifier or multiple amplifiers. Now, if your AVR does have amplifier pre-outs like the SR8015, you can easily add external amplification to some or even all of the channels. So you could use, say, a 5-channel amplifier to power your front, left, center, and right, and maybe your 2 side surrounds, and then let the AVR power your Atmos speakers and maybe your surround back speakers. Or if you want to power all of your speakers, you could plug in maybe a multi-channel amplifier like a 7-channel, a 9-channel, or even 11-channel amplifier to the pre-outs of your AVR and use the external amplification as opposed to the AVR's internal amplification. Now there are a couple of downsides to an AVR when compared to a processor. Now because they have internal amplification, sometimes even a large toroidal transformer, that generates a lot of heat. Now because of that, I highly recommend getting something like the AC Infinity Aircom cooling system to place on top of the unit to pull some of that heat upward and to allow your AVR to last much longer. Now I have links to several Aircoms down in the description below if you're interested in one of those. Now the biggest negative that I find with an AVR is because you have one single chassis that is trying to do video processing, audio processing, video upscaling, maybe from 1080p to 4K or 4K to 8K. And on top of that, it's trying to power all of your speakers, whether that's 7 speakers, 9 speakers, 11 speakers, or even 13 speakers. That's a lot to expect from a single receiver. And because each one of those channels rely on a single power supply, when you add more speakers, you get less wattage per speaker. So now let's look at the pros and cons of going with separates or with a dedicated processor and external amplifier. Now when you go with separates, it offers a lot of flexibility. It's completely okay to choose one manufacturer for your processor and a totally different manufacturer for your amplifier. So in my case, I have a Marantz AV7705 processor, but then I have a Monolith 11X amplifier from Monoprice. Another great benefit of going with separates is typically when you buy an amplifier, it's going to last you for decades. Now, if you buy a quality amplifier, it's going to cost a pretty good amount, but it's one of those things, kind of like they always say, you buy once, you cry once. And for the most part, technology in amplifiers doesn't really change that much. So when the next latest greatest format comes out, whether it's 8K, whether it's a new immersive audio format, you don't have to upgrade your amplifier, you only need to upgrade your processor. Now, as I mentioned with the AVR, another benefit of going with a processor is it tends to run a lot cooler because it does not have internal amplification. Now, I'll be honest guys, Typically in the past, I've always owned an AVR because of its simplicity, because I didn't have to worry about having multiple components, and then on top of that, honestly, it's just a lot cheaper to go that route. But I always hear from guys that own separates, you know, how great they are and how great they sound, and once you go separates, it's really hard to go back to an AVR, and so I wanted to see that for myself to see, is there a difference? Can I physically hear a difference in the sound of a processor versus an AVR? And so I think about a year ago, I reached out to Marantz and asked them if they would send me the AV7705 so that I could test it out and see how does it compare. At that time, I believe I had the SR8015 Marantz AVR. Now in the past, I have added amplifiers to my AVRs. My clip speakers are very sensitive, and so they don't require a lot of power. And what I found for my system, adding an external amplifier like a Parasound A52 Plus or 51 Plus, I think it was, that's about 180 watts per channel by 5. I've had a Sherborne amplifier that was 200 watts by 7. Each time I added an amplifier, I didn't hear a big difference in the sound. I got a little bit better channel separation, like with musical instruments. I also heard more bottom end from my speakers, even at lower volume. And then of course you've got tons of headroom, so you can crank it really loud and you never have to worry about an amplifier kind of running out of gas. So if you have speakers that have a lower sensitivity, you would probably hear a lot more difference than I did in your system by adding an amplifier to an AVR. But up until this point, I kind of viewed a processor as a company like Marantz taking the SR8012, removing the amplifier and saying, okay, here you go, here's the processor. But that is not actually correct. A dedicated processor tends to use higher quality components and better audio processing. So once I got the AV7705 in for review, that's when I heard the biggest difference. It wasn't adding an amplifier to a receiver and kind of looking at that as separates. Instead, the biggest difference I heard was when I separated and went to a dedicated processor, the AV7705, and pairing that with the Monolith 11X. I also reviewed the Emotiva XPA11, which also was a fantastic 11-channel amplifier. Now to me, I heard a lot better dialogue. I had better separation of each individual channel. So it was like my Atmos speakers were clearer, my surrounds were more distinct, my front channels sounded more impactful. And so I heard that biggest difference going to separates. So more than likely at some point in your home theater journey, you're going to have to make that decision. Do I want to go with an AVR or do I want to invest in separates? And honestly, you've got to make that decision. You have to weigh those pros and cons, you know, the cost factor versus, you know, what do you get on the return on your investment type of thing. And so you've got to make that decision. I'll post links down in the description to a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about. I'll share with you some processors that I think are great. I'll also share with you some amplifiers that might work well with those processors. And so if you're interested in any of those, definitely check those out down in the description below. Now I have an unboxing as well as a full review of the Marantz AV7705 processor. I'll link to it right up here in the card above. So be sure to check that out if you're interested. And make sure you're subscribed to the channel because I'm actually working on the final review of the Monolith HTP1 processor, and then I'll be soon reviewing the Marantz SR8015 AVR. Well guys, if you found this video helpful, make sure to like and share this video. It definitely helps out the channel. I've also got links down in the description to everything we've talked about in this video. And as always, you guys be blessed, and we'll catch you in the next video.